Hello YouTube, welcome back to another YouTube video, and today we have a tier list for the new TCG format with a little bit of a focus on how Mulcharmy Fuwalos has impacted the format. We're obviously going to talk about all of the popular and meta decks, but we're also going to put a lot of focus on how Mulcharmy Fuwalos allows certain decks to thrive in this new environment. But I do want to start by talking about some of the big guns in the format first, just to set the baseline for this format and this discussion. Like, what kind of decks are we dealing with the most? The elephant in the room, a definitely format defining / top tier deck, is going to be Snake Eyes Azamina / honestly, Fire King Snake Eyes Azamina is probably even better than Snake Eyes Azamina. But both of these decks relatively close to each other, I would say, in terms of power level. Personally, if I had to differentiate between the two, pure Snake Eyes probably has more room for non-engine because you don't have to fit all those Fire King cards. By adding the Fire King cards to your deck, they're not all great to draw. You know, sometimes you do draw like the old Garunix if you choose to play it together with Alcanics, or you draw like a Kirin without anything useful to destroy or something like that. So like overall, the pure Snake Eye deck has more room for non-engine. However, I do think from my first impression that the Fire King deck has better lines under Fuwalos. And I think that's one of the main reasons why the deck was able to win the YCS versus the bunch of Snake Eye decks that made it into top 32, which is something that makes sense to me because it's like the Snake Eye Azamina deck makes it through Swiss rounds relatively consistently, but I feel like at some point in Top Cut, you're probably going to play against the Fuwalos. You're only going to put up like an IP Masquerena, and it's just not going to be enough. Whereas the Fire King deck, I feel like has more solid plans for those kind of situations, which I think that's what sets it as like a tournament winning kind of deck in this environment. But those are these two. Next up, I want to talk about Yubel, which is definitely still a good deck, and it can still put up the exact same boards as before. This deck is still going to perform in this format. I personally don't like it as much as other decks, simply because I don't feel like this deck has a good plan against Mulcharmy Fuwalos. If you have to put cards like Crossout Designator into your main deck, I think you're starting to make your deck too weak overall, because that card is not good when you're going second, and going second is already going to be hard against some of these decks in the format. I personally don't like Ubel over other options in this format. I think it's an inferior combo deck to other combo decks that have solid lines against Fuwalos, so I'm going to rate it relatively low compared to other decks. But just be aware that the deck is still incredibly scary to go up against, incredibly dangerous, and still very, very powerful. It's just the fact that Fuwalos balances it more than other decks that makes me put it a tier lower than previously, because it was obviously the big one in the previous format, the most represented deck in Top Cut. Just the fact that it went from being the most represented deck in Top Cut at YCS Lille by far to like third or fourth most represented deck in Top Cut for YCS Niagara, even though the deck itself hasn't changed at all. I think Yubel is going to have to adjust to this format. I don't think you can just play the ignorant Yubel Fiendsmith piles that people have been using last format. I think you actually have to make your deck more like resilient into Fuwalos if you can, right? Cross out or even Kashtira engines and stuff like that. Those were cards that previously were not played, or not played much, for good reason, I feel like. Especially if you're playing like Board Breaker Yubel, which was the one that Sam won the YCS with. If you're going first, you have a bunch of Board Breakers in your deck and like full-on Yubel engine. If you get Fuwalos, you're passing on essentially nothing unless you want to give your opponent 3, 4, 5 cards. Yubel definitely takes a big hit from Rage of the Abyss release, which is a good thing. And then I also want to get Tenpai out of the way. I feel like those are kind of like the big four that set the pace for everything else. Tenpai still format defining, absolutely. I don't think it's the best deck in the format, simply because, I mean, I'm personally not the biggest fan of Tenpai, but I can't deny how powerful the deck is. The deck is handmade for Shifter, Fuwalos, and Perulia, all go in your main deck with no questions asked. I think Tenpai is really powerful and something you definitely have to be prepared for in this format. Your performance is still very heavily dependent on how well people do prepare for it. You know, like if people start siding more for the deck because people expect it to be played more due to like Fuwalos and Perulia and Shifter being in the deck and all that kind of stuff, then people might like start playing D-Barriers or something. We saw Ryan Yu getting second at the YCS with siding D-Barrier and threatening Roar, so that's always scary, but can't really deny that it is part of the format defining defining threats for sure. It is that powerful. It's kind of a shame that it loses the sort of like budget deck style position because of Fuwalos being added to it. It is no longer that. The way we're gonna rate these other decks is based on their matchups into these decks up here and into the non-engine that is going to be the most relevant in the upcoming format, which I think is Mulcharmy's. And then bonus points, style points, if you can play Dominus Impulse or if Dominus Impulse is terrible against your deck. First things first, we've got Branded, which I think is between all right and potential. I'll throw it at the bottom of good. I think Branded is a good deck. Well, here's the thing. Mulcharmy Fuwalos does not kill Branded, but the more I'm thinking about it, Impulse just gives people more copies of Ash Blossom, technically, right? And that could be a problem. That's a copy of Ash Blossom that you can't even like Cult by the Grave, or you can't even thrust into fusion duplication against it. So maybe I'll just put Branded in all right. I was thinking mostly of Fuwalos, which the deck is fine into, but then Dominus Impulse was also very, very, very popular, and Ash Blossom is going to be as popular as ever, of course. With everyone or most people playing Fuwalos and expecting Fuwalos, they will also play Ash Blossom to counter it. Branded gets caught in the crossfire. All right, so yeah, no, I've convinced myself to put Branded in all right. Centurion, though, on the other hand, is a deck that I personally really, really like. I'm a huge fan of Centurion. I can't go any discussion about Mulcharmy Fuwalos without mentioning Centurion. It still is the same deck as before, really, which was kind of like this mid-rangey deck with a lot of room for hand traps. The downside to Centurion is that it doesn't play well through like half boards, right? Like it doesn't have the biggest amount of pushes, right? You have your normal summon, you have an extender with the field spell maybe, or Emblema, and then maybe you have a Bestial to threaten something, and that's about it. You're not going to have access to all of those because usually you open 2 to 3 to 4 hand traps. That's why I'm not putting it in top tier, but I do think it's a deck that is very, very good into both Mulcharmy Fuwalos and Pearly. And actually, if you go first, you go uninterrupted, or you play through their hand traps, this deck can actually set up much more powerful boards now with the new Chimera Primus, because you can search Emblema Oath, which means you'll draw extra cards with Atri. Atri basically is like a little heat soul because you draw one on every turn, right? You draw one on your turn, draw one on the opponent's turn. It's really powerful. You'll draw into more hand traps, and you actually also have better lines now than before, where previously 1-card combos would get you to Auxilla plus the trap card and set up like a Blazer Dragon on the opponent's turn. You can actually set up Blazer on your own turn and another one on the opponent's turn with 1 card now very easily, if you don't get Fuwalos. So I like this deck a lot. I personally would always play Centurion before I touch the Yubel deck, but there's also some bias going into that because I just enjoy the deck much more than Yubel. Going through a tournament with a deck that's good into Fuwalos, good into Pearly, actually has solid lines into Shifter, your tournament runs are going to be less impacted by variance with Centurion, right? There's going to be games where you look at your hand going second and you don't have the right hand traps and your opponent sets up a board and you're not going to be able to play through it. That happens with the deck, but then like you're not going to be blown out as much by other cards in the format. So I like this deck. I think it's good. I think it has some potential. Pack went undefeated in Swiss with it at the YCS, took it all the way to top 16. I think the deck is good. I think it's going to be a nice deck in this format, especially if you're sick of not being able to play under Fuwalos, Shifter, Pearly kind of thing. Blue is one of those decks that gets to play Shifter and gets to ignore Fuwalos entirely, of course, because you are not summoning from extra deck or deck ever. The other problem is that Mulcharmy Fuwalos has not gone. That card is still good, and that card cooks Blue. From my perspective, if you're looking for a Shifter deck that doesn't care about Pearly or Fuwalos, you should just be playing Tenpai, if that's what you care about. But Fluonaries is still okay. Pearly is a side deck card. Fuwalos is a main deck card, so that's an advantage, right? You're good against the main deck non-engine. You're not good against every main deck non-engine though, right? Because like Imperm, Veiler, Ash, Ghost Ogre are still popular cards that can mess you up. Droll as well. It is good into Impulse though, right? Because Impulse only stops cards that would special summon, which also dead card against Flu. Like the YCS winning Fire King deck was main decking 3 Fuwalos and 3 Impulse, which is 6 dead cards against Flu. Right? So like that's an advantage. I'm using the wrong cover monster for Chimera because Bearfomet is still in the deck, but he's not doing the heavy lifting anymore. I should use like Gazelle or Nightmare Apprentice, but it is what it is. I like Chimera a lot. The Chimera Fiendsmith deck, obviously, if you were trying to go for the full combo, you would be suffering a lot from Fuwalos. However, and this is probably gonna surprise some people, I'm gonna rate this deck higher than Ubel. I already felt like last format, Fiendsmith Chimera and Fiendsmith Ubel were relatively relatively close to each other in power level. There was a lot of good players I know that played Chimera at YCS Lil over Yubel. The deck is very powerful and I think it's very underrated. The reason why I'm rating it higher than Yubel now is because I think it has better lines into Fuwalos. Both of these decks, if they go uninterrupted, unironically, they will auto win the game. You guys try breaking a Yubel board, you're not going to be able to do it. Try breaking a Chimera board. If your opponent properly sets it up, you're not going to break it. It does not get broken. The Chimera end board is insane. Chimera has better lines into Fuwalos. You have to forego your Fiendsmith lines, but you can still, in one summon from the extra deck, you can make the Chimera fusion that hand rips your opponent. You can reset the Chimera fusion for a Guardian Chimera on their turn, and you can potentially set up the Mirror Sword Knight negate in the graveyard by just like leaving it on the board. You don't have to tribute it on your turn to give your opponent the draw. You can also tribute it on the opponent's turn, so it goes into the graveyard, you summon the Baphomet from the deck. I think the deck is better into Fuwalos than Yubel. Now into Shifter, they both suck. But all of these top decks suck into Shifter except for Tenpai and Centurion. Of course, Yubel is better into other hand traps because of Phantom, but Fuwalos I think is the most important hand trap to worry about at the moment. The things I said about Flu also apply to Kashtira, but Kashtira is not as weak into Perulia, so it's like all right. The problem with Kashtira is basically that your boards are very, very breakable. I think when you're playing Kashtira, you actually want to get hand trapped, right? You actually want your opponent to like play into your Unicorn so you can look at their extra deck, take one card out, because it feels like with Unicorn, you need more than just one Unicorn effect to actually win the game off of it. If you get 2 to 3 looks at their extra deck, then it's really painful. Then you're actually winning the game off of it. Labyrinth is a deck that made top 4 at the YCS. Both Trap Lab and Furniture Lab are 2 decks that I like a lot. I think they're very good. I think they can be made into decks that can counter what's being played in the meta very well. The deck can play Impulse, which is nice. I like this deck. I'm going to put it here. This is my bias towards mid-range decks over full-on combo in a format where Fuwalos exists. This is very much subjective. Some people will prefer the decks that are more unfair and just try to negate your opponent's Fuwalos. I personally don't like that kind of approach. I personally much rather play a deck that already has a solid plan into those kind of cards. I just hate the position of I'm playing Yubel and I know that every time in a tournament I win the dice roll, I have to really worry about my opponent open Fuwalos or I might get cooked. That's why I'm rating Yubel rather low. Overall, statistically, not all of your opponents are going to open Fuwalos, and a good amount of the time you're going to be able to negate it. If there are other options that can avoid playing that kind of mini game, I would prefer those options. That is me personally. And that's why I'm rating Centurion, Lab, and Chimera a little higher than Ubel, because I really don't like the all-in kind of strategy. But yes, if you resolve your Ubel combo, you will win the game. That hasn't changed. Melodious, on the other hand, unfortunately, is a deck that gets caught in the crossfire here relatively hard. Couple of things that are unfortunate for Melodious. Can't play Impulse, which is annoying. Impulse, very good against the deck because it can negate first movement solo and ostinato, and that's giga annoying. And it's a good chunk of draws under Fuwalos. If you want to go for your full setup, you're giving like 3 to 4. Even if you are trying to not play into it too much, you'd have to like still do 2 to 3. It's not great. You can orange light Fuwalos, but that's not a favorable trade for you. That's not great. It's a good highlight because you really see how some decks that were on equal power levels beforehand, like I would argue Centurion, Melodious, and Labyrinth were all around the same level before Rage of the Abyss. They were all like average tier 2 decks, but some decks really benefit from Fuwalos more than others. Centurion and Lab, if you look at those decks, they definitely benefit way more than Melodious, whereas Melodious, this entire set kind of hurts Melodious. Unfortunately, it gets caught in the crossfire of Impulse and Fuwalos a fair amount. Retaliating Sea is also good against it, which is a card that people have been playing against the Snake Eye deck, so yeah, that's true. Memento, I have a tough time evaluating. The deck does not access the extra deck as much if you are under Fuwalos. I'm pretty sure the deck has lines. The problem is I am not a Memento expert. I'm gonna hold off on giving too much of a prediction on where it's gonna end up. Impulse is good against it, I'm pretty sure, but I'm gonna be honest with you, Impulse is good against almost any deck. It just hurts some decks more than others, right? Like it hurts Branded more than it hurts, I don't know, Centurion, for example. I'm gonna give it the benefit of the doubt, and I'm gonna put it here. I think the deck might have potential. It seemed like the Lacrima ban hurt it more than I originally anticipated. I feel like I rated it too highly last time, but if it's really true that that it's almost immune to Fuwalos, then I could see it popping up again. I just realized I forgot Mermail. Mermail Atlantean is a deck that I used to really like back in the day. And when I say back in the day, I mean back in the day. Like I'm talking 2013, 14 back in the day, not after Neptibus released. Because I feel like the deck has turned into like a very much go first, pop off, go second, usually lose kind of deck. It is scary regardless because it has very powerful lines now. You can make Bahamut Shark into Toad multiple times a turn, end on some really oppressive boards, including ripping your opponent's hand with Mooling Glacier, which is a play that you can probably still do under Fuwalos relatively consistently. Of course, you can't spam Toads under Fuwalos because every single time you summon a Toad, it would be multiple summons from the extra deck. You can probably still cook a little bit under Fuwalos with Mermail. Still, I think the deck going second is not powerful enough to actually put it into the good category. I think it slots somewhere in all right because it is a very, very dangerous combo deck that can also play Impulse because it's water monsters. I think it's a playable deck. I wouldn't be surprised if someone like tops a regional with it, or if someone gets lucky with it, maybe even tops a YCS for now. Pearly is a deck that I think won't see that much play in this upcoming format. I haven't been a fan of Pearly in a while. I feel like the deck has always been very average. The deck was good into Perulia, but it doesn't feel great into Fuwalos, right? Like you summon your Pearlies from the deck, you rank up into a couple, like you're going to give your opponent some draws. You cannot play Impulse in the deck as well, and you can get hit by Impulse on your quick play spells. Or even when you're trying to rank up, you can also get hit by Impulse on that. Like your once per turn Lily rank up, they can Impulse that. That's annoying. I'm not thrilled by the Pearly deck. It's not terrible. And I think that's the story of this format, is that there's going to be a lot of decks that are all right. There are not that many decks on this list that I'm going to actually end up throwing into like the meh category, like the decks I wouldn't recommend anyone playing. Pearly's close to it, honestly. I don't really see a reason to play Pearly over other decks unless you just really like. Can't you Impulse the Trap too? You should be able to Impulse the Trap too. Yeah, if they try to set that up to rank up on your turn, you can stop that too, which is really powerful as well. It is cheap, which is true. If you ignore, obviously Fuwalos would go into most of these decks, but most of the decks in all right, I guess that is your reason to play them over some decks up here, is that they are significantly cheaper because they don't play Fiendsmith / Impulse in some of these. Ritual Beast is a deck that I was a fan of in the last formats. I thought it always was a very high potential deck that I never actually took the time to properly learn, but I am a fan of the deck. I think it's good. I think Fuwalos hurts it a lot. I think I'm going to move it down a tier. Maybe it's better than Memento, but that's roughly where I would put it. I think it's still solid. It's still a shifter deck. That's always the thing. How bad can a shifter deck really be? It's the shifter deck in this list that's probably the weakest to Fuwalos, and that's annoying. Runic Stun, it might be like the first YCS in a long time that no one actually topped with Runic Stun. Like Runic Stun has been not dominating, but like I feel like every single time there was a YCS, you would see like 1 or 2 Runic Stun in Top Cut. I still think the deck is all right. I don't see a reason why the deck wouldn't at least be playable. I guess Tenpai can be a rough matchup, but you have like Hugins to stop the Duster and the Lightning Storms and all that. I mean, Skill Drain went to 1, but that didn't stop it from doing good performances before Rage of the Abyss, so I think it's still all right. As much as it pains me to say it, I think Salad might be the first deck I'm putting in meh. Simply because if you're playing Salad, you're just asking to be destroyed by every single non-engine that people play. Now, if you go uninterrupted, Salad can cook, but it doesn't feel like it has an advantage, right? I'm looking at the decks in all right, and I'm like, okay, well, at least Runic Stun doesn't care about Fuwalos. At least Ritual Beast can play Shifter and doesn't care about Shifter itself. At least Melodious has like really powerful one-card starters like Ostinato and First Movement Solo, Kashtira Shifter deck, Flu Shifter deck, Branded Solid Lines under Fuwalos. Salamangre just loses to all those cards, which is really annoying because if the deck cooks, it's actually quite cool. It just loses to too many cards, man. Tearlaments is a deck that I did not have on my radar at all, but it did win the Swiss Open, which I think was a relatively big regional last weekend. It was one of those piles where you just play 60 cards, Grass, Thrust, Left Arm Offering, Horus cards, and then the Tearlaments, honestly, without Kitkalos, they played like a smaller role in it, I guess. I mean, it's still an impressive showing. I looked at it. I'm not convinced it's going to hold up a top tier position. Maybe here, it's definitely all right. It's playable. I'm not surprised it did well at a regional. It's just not something I have on my radar for like more good performances. Like it can, if you get a lucky performance with it. I'm not convinced by the Tearlament's strongest in the TCG at the moment. Sky Striker got second place at YCS Niagara in the hands of Ryan Yu. And I want to put an emphasis on that, in the hands of Ryan Yu. I've seen the profile. I've seen the reasoning behind some of the cards. The deck looks really cool. The deck looks fun to play. The deck is not going to be top tier or even high potential. I mean, it got second at a YCS. How bad can it be, right? It can't be terrible. In the right hands, I think it's all right. I think it's one of those decks that requires very good technical play as well, which is a fun challenge because like if you do get to go second, most of the time it's not as simple as Tenpai, like break the board, kill them. You do most of the time have to like pick apart their board piece by piece and then worry about their follow-up and think about how you're going to live through the next turn and stuff like that. If you play this deck very well, you can perform with it. It is just simply like a more complicated and worse version of Tenpai. I'm gonna put branded here and this here. Like that, like that. It's gonna be painful, but we have to get through it together. Mimigul goes here. It's a real shame because the reason I'm doing this, a lot of decks are playing Dominus Impulse. And Dominus Impulse completely floodgates Mimigul for the rest of the game without even a way to interact with it. It's not something you can get rid of by having removal for it later or something like that. It's just a lingering floodgate for the rest of the game randomly against this deck. Just in case anyone who's watching this isn't aware of the interaction, if you're playing Mimigul and your opponent uses Dominus Impulse from the hand, they are locked out of Earth monsters for the rest of the game. So whenever you give them a Mimigul and it flips, it can't activate because your opponent controls it and it's an Earth monster. It just never works. Otherwise, it'd be an interesting deck. It wouldn't be top tier otherwise. Maybe it'd be all right or potential. Maybe I'd mess around with it. But like at a high competitive level, you just expect a lot of decks to play Dominus Impulse and you just can't play the deck into it. It just doesn't work. That's the shame because it's not even worth exploring. Otherwise, it would be. It would be worth testing. Maybe it would end up good. Maybe it wouldn't. But like, it's not worth trying because everyone, or not everyone, but like a majority of people are gonna have an insane floodgate against you in their main deck that even works when you go second. Unfortunate situation for Mimigul. The Exodia deck, there was a lot of hype surrounding it. The list that topped YCS Niagara, as hype as it sounds that someone made top cut with an Exodia deck, I hate to break it to you, but that deck is basically just floodgate turbo. Your plan is when you go first, you try to set up Omni Negates with Secret Village of the Spellcaster, and then it's also a shifter deck. It's stun in disguise, but with some cool anime bat chest elements to it. Power level wise, I think it just slots like in the middle here. Like it's not a terrible deck because how bad can a deck like that really be? The concept can work in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Whether you like it or not, it is not more than that. Plants. Look, I'm from Europe. I'm gonna be honest with you guys. I don't like this deck. You guys know I don't like plants, but like, I don't think it's a good deck. I really don't. I said it. I don't know how it keeps doing what it does. By every single logic in the universe, this deck should not be performing, right? It's not good into a lot of things, right? It's not great into Impulse. It's not great into Perulia. It's not good into Shifter. It's not good into Fuwalos. This deck shouldn't do shit. For some reason, there's a cult out there in Europe of people playing the plant deck and being actually good with it and still topping YCS. It's like, I'm pretty sure Julius topped YCS Niagara with it, lost in top 32, I think to Jesse. Somehow the deck keeps doing what it does. There's like maybe 5 people in the world who keep doing well with the deck and keep bringing it to tournaments like that's a religion or something. I don't think it's a good deck, but because I'm from Europe and because I'm scared, I'm gonna put it here. I think Rescue Ace might be back. The deck has topped YCS Niagara in multiples, similar to how the deck functions in Master Duel well into Max C. It is even better into Fuwalos than it is into Max C because you're summoning mostly from hand. They draw 1 card for emergency, and then whatever you decide to summon from the extra deck, like if you decide to end on an IP or SP or something like that, you'll give another one. But for the most part, you can set up a Turbulence in maybe 1 draw. It is not great into Ash and Impulse. The deck can also play Dominus Impulse itself, I'm pretty sure. I think it's all right. I'm gonna put it in potential. I think it's a solid mid-range deck. I don't like it as much as Labyrinth and Centurion personally, but it's got potential. Sprites, on the other hand, I don't feel like are anything crazy. Perulia is super annoying for Sprite. So is Fuwalos. I don't see an advantage in playing Sprite. It pains me because I'm putting decks down here in Med that I actually really like. And that is the trade-off that we as a community have to do right now with Fuwalos, right? That is the pros and cons, right? It moves decks like Yubel down a level, which is definitely something that we can appreciate. Other decks are being caught in the crossfire, right? And Salamangreat and Sprites Those are decks that I really like. They were previously already rogue-ish, and the fact that Fuwalos gets introduced into the game doesn't help them. That is what it is. Not the time to play Sprite. Maybe another time. White Forest Runic is obviously a deck that I've been playing a lot. I like it a lot as well. I think there are a couple things to consider when picking White Forest Runic for a tournament right now. The first thing is that going second into Yubel last format was basically impossible. So the good news is there are less Yubels, and even if you do play against Yubel, you do have the chance of drawing Fuwalos and stopping them from setting up their crazy unbreakable board. Whether you main deck Fuwalos or side it is a different story, right? Of course, Hugin can discard it, but the White Forest cards cannot send it for cost because it's not a spell trap, so that's a little annoying. Overall, I think the deck is all right. I don't think it's the right time to really pop off with this deck. It's rough going second, right? You're not completely lost into Fuwalos. Like, you can do cool things where you activate a Runic, they chain Fuwalos to it, you activate another Runic. The thing you do against Maxi, if you're lucky and you have Sylvie in your hand, you can normal summon Sylvie, get the trap card, set it, and then pass, and then they didn't get a single draw off of Fuwalos, and you have Fountain plus the trap. It's not a complete disaster, but it's also not ideal. So it's like kind of in the middle. Like, it's probably the best out of the tier 2 decks or rogue-ish decks. Then we've got White Forest Azamina, which is an interesting thing to look at. I've seen some people mess around with it, and not anyone to any success. I think this deck suffers simply from the fact that other combo decks are much stronger than it. I see no reason to play this deck over Azamina Snake Eyes, Pure Snake Eye, Azamina, Fire King, Yubel, Chimera. I just think there's more powerful combo decks right now, but it is not unplayable. Maybe here? It is a deck to be on the lookout for, though, because it depends a lot on how they handle the Azamina cards on future Forbidden and Limited lists. If they just touch Snake Eye and Yubel cards directly and leave the Azamina cards alone, then Supreme Darkness could definitely elevate this deck into a top tier meta threat. Right now, it's just like a fun little rogue deck to mess around with. It could change after Supreme Darkness for sure. Voiceless Voice, a mid-range deck that puts up incredibly breakable boards, but the advantage is that this deck is almost completely immune to Fuwalos and other hand traps. You guys are saying meh. I don't think it's meh. Look at Master Duel right now. Voiceless Voice is a competent deck in Master Duel, and it's competing with very powerful combo decks because one of its advantages is that it's good into Maxi. Now, it's even better into Fuwalos than it is into Maxi for us in the TCG. Yeah, the deck can brick, but it's a very solid mid-rangey deck. Here is where I would put it, which I think is higher than you guys expected, judging from your responses in chat. I actually don't think it's that bad. I really think it's a playable deck that people just disregard too quickly. Similar to Centurion, honestly. Centurion and Voiceless are two decks that people just are very quick to just say, oh, they're too fair, their boards aren't strong enough and all that kind of stuff. All that really means is that you have to put some more work into actually winning your games, right? It's not as simple as making a Yubel board and your opponent just can't break it no matter how you use your interrupts. Voices and Centurion, you gotta like interrupt your opponent in the correct spots. You gotta know the choke points and all that kind of stuff. I do like Voiceless. I just don't think it's as good as Centurion. That is the situation that we're in right now. I think, at least, that's my prediction. Let me know what you think. I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of other opinions. Keep it civil in the comments. Give me feedback on what you think. Maybe I was missing something. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the tier list. I hope it helps you evaluate your deck better for this format. The cool thing about this format is that it's going to take a while, right? We're going to have the time to reevaluate in a couple weeks to see how this developed. We're going to have more events. We're going to have YCS Bologna using the same sets and all that kind of stuff. It's going to take a while. That's always cool. Give this format some time to develop. I personally, I'm looking forward to it. I think there's a lot of stuff in here that's cool to play. We'll see how it turns out. For now, thanks for watching, YouTube. Until next time. Bye bye.